In a small crossroads town in Arizona, 2,000 men, women, and children gather on a Sunday to celebrate their religious convictions in a private meeting hall. 300 miles north, a congregation leader greets families that gather for the same purpose. By the time the first song ends, more than 1,000 worshipers fill the hall in Utah's Salt Lake Valley. Even further north, children begin a day of private school with the Pledge of Allegiance, then kneel in prayer. From Montana, they direct their prayers to the temple of a church that has banned them from membership. Linking these groups that span almost 1,000 miles in the Mountain West is a central belief that their God has blessed the practice of celestial marriage, plural marriage in layman's terms, polygamy in the eyes of the law. That belief binds them to the history of a region reaching from Canada to Mexico, committing their lives to the shadows of society, embracing beliefs that have often led the believer behind prison bars. Nestled fast against the sharp rise of the Bitterroot Range in western Montana is one of the state's newest towns. Removed from the main highway and with a population just under 1,000, it's easy to miss the town of Pinesdale, which is just what the people of Pinesdale had in mind when they bought the land 40 years ago.
That was the first reason it was bought, is to be a haven for people who needed a place for refuge that was being sought by the law at that time for living unlawful. Plural marriage. They called it unlawful cohabitation.
Pinesdale, Montana is made up of members of the Apostolic United Brethren. They are bound together by their belief that a man taking multiple wives is living an ancient and renewed law of God, a law higher than those made by man that would outlaw polygamy.
Well, our goal is basically to build up the kingdom of God. We would like to live our religion as peaceful as we can. We don't want to push our religion on anybody, and we'd like to be left alone in living it.
But for more than a century, American society has had a keen interest in the religion practiced by men like Morris Jessup. A dubious general public has identified polygamists as cult figures, zealots, and threats to American values. The scrutiny takes a toll that can be sensed when the men and women of Pinesdale testify to their belief in plural marriage, what they call simply the principle.
I'm thankful for my family. I have been more grateful lately for the principle of plural marriage, for that experience, for my beautiful wives. I have come home to my plural family, and so appreciate it that God has given me that opportunity.
Polygamy is neither new to religion or new to this region of the United States, but it has defied acceptance for more than a dozen decades and is part of the shadow history of the American West. Until Joseph Smith founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church, in the early 1800s, most Americans relegated plural marriage to Africa and the Far East. But in the early 1840s, Smith began confiding in trusted associates that he had received authority from God to restore polygamy in accordance with biblical precedent. Smith's incorporation of polygamy into Mormon belief contributed to a series of events that culminated in his murder by a mob in Illinois in 1844. Legendary Mormon leader Brigham Young succeeded Smith at the helm of the struggling church and led the Mormons on a cross-country odyssey that ended in the isolated and desolate Salt Lake Valley in 1847.
And the Mormons objected to the world in a sense. They wanted to form Zion. Zion was the great organizing motif, really. Everything circled around a concept of a community so fine that God could dwell with humankind in harmony. There came to be enough hysteria against the Mormons that even the degree of isolation they found themselves in the Great Basin wasn't sufficient.
The hysteria erupted in 1852 when the Mormon Church publicly announced for the first time that polygamy, as conveyed by God through Joseph Smith, was a part of the Mormon faith. Brigham Young announced that plural marriage was God's law and would soon be recognized worldwide as, quote, one of the best doctrines ever proclaimed to any people.
The general reaction of the American people was one of profound disgust, shock, that within American society there was a group of people publicly advocating the practice of plural marriage.
Lincoln had enough sense not to come to grips with Brigham on this issue. When asked how he would respond to the Mormon issue, he said, if I have a stump in the field, I plow around it. And that's pretty well what he did. I say by accident, possibly, too, in that the Civil War caused the country to be concerned with a much more important issue for them to deal with than Mormon polygamy.
With the end of the Civil War, Congress decided to plow through rather than around what was called the Mormon problem. For Congress, the problem went far beyond polygamy. The Mormon Church exerted nearly complete political control over the Utah Territory and also practiced a closed economic system of Christian socialism called the United Order.
And for many of the more serious people, I think they were more concerned with Mormon theocracy in a secular democratic state than they were polygamy. But polygamy became the issue that could make that a popular thing. Getting people angry about a theocracy is not easy, a big number of people. Getting them angry about something that seems overly sensual and bizarre, as polygamy seemed to many to be, is easier.
If you look at the people who practice plural marriage, and look at the church leadership, members of the Council of the 12 and First Presidency, stake presidents, stake high councils, bishops, most of them practiced plural marriage. Virtually all of them did.
The handful of federal officials in the Utah Territory expressed dismay that a new generation of Mormon children was being indoctrinated to plural marriage.
They were told by their parents that it was essential for their exaltation, that they'd never reach the highest degree in the celestial kingdom without practicing plural marriage. And that was something that was seen as part of the church and essential.
With between 27 and 56 wives, depending on the source, Brigham Young was the undisputed center of defiance in the Utah Territory to federal attempts to control polygamy.
Brigham Young used to have what he called his whittlers, people who would follow the federal marshal with a pocket knife and a little bit of wood. He'd say, we won't want to hurt them, we don't want to have any violence here, but you can whittle. And you'd hear the laughter through the tabernacle as Brigham would say this in General Conference, meaning we can intimidate the heck out of these guys.
But Congress and the federal courts were not intimidated by defiant pioneers building a homeland that intertwined church and state into a blurred image.
Presidents and Congresses are getting second and third and 10th-hand accounts of what the Mormons are about. They're often lurid, ludicrous, exaggerated, and you have enough hysteria that the kinds of protections we normally have in civil rights drop away.
How far polygamy had removed the Mormons from American society was tested in the late 1870s. Young's personal secretary, George Reynolds, was selected to serve as a test case before the U.S. Supreme Court, claiming plural marriage was a constitutionally protected religious belief.
And essentially what the Supreme Court said was that you could believe anything that you wanted to, but that you couldn't practice any way you wanted to. They differentiated between belief and practice. Generally, most Mormons felt the way Rutger Clausen did when he said that he was sorry that the laws of the United States came into conflict with the laws of God, but that he would feel himself unworthy if he didn't obey the laws of God.
Brigham Young died before the Supreme Court decision placed polygamy, and by extension the Mormons, clearly outside of the law of the land. But if the federal government assumed the primary protagonist of the polygamy drama was out of the way, they received a rude surprise in the next Mormon leader, John Taylor.
If anything, he was more adamant than Brigham Young was. He essentially nailed the flag to the mast on plural marriage, saying we're not going to give up at all on the thing.